Dave is a veteran with lived experience. Dave has dedicated the last 4 or more years speaking out about gambling addiction amongst veterans and the active military through his podcast and his books. It's not widely known that the active military, it's not widely known the extent of gambling problems within the military, and Dave will fill us in, weaving his own story in with the work he is currently doing. I first met Dave when I attended the NCPG conference in Washington, D.C. in 2023, and have attended a couple of webinars and listened to his podcasts. I'm so appreciative of Dave's voice and drawing attention to yet another group of people negatively impacted by gambling. Most recently, Dave was elected to the NCPG Board of Directors, where we both serve to support NCPG's mission. And Dave is also a behavioral health coach with Kindbridge Behavior Health. So please join me in welcoming Dave Yeager. I think it'll stay. The clicker is here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Big green button.
Big green button.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here and staying around. I know it's been a long day, and I appreciate you sticking around to hear what I have to say. I want to start off with this. I'm dedicating the next hour to two people who saw me at my worst and got to see me move toward my best. My mother, who went home on August 15th, and my father, who went home this morning. I know they're watching, and I know they want me to be here, and I know they're happy. So this is for them. No one's more professional than I. I'm a non-commissioned officer, a leader of soldiers. As a non-commissioned officer, I realize that I'm a member of a time-honored corps, which is known as the backbone of the Army. I'm proud of the Corps of non-commissioned officers and will, at all times, conduct myself so as to bring credit upon the Corps, the military service, and my country, regardless of the situation in which I find myself. I will not use my grade or position to attain pleasure, profit, or personal safety. That's the first paragraph from the Creed of the Non-Commissioned Officer for the United States Army, which I spoke when I first put on stripes in the Army. I did not live by that creed, not completely. And that's what I want to talk about today, in addition to military service members and veterans who might struggle with gambling. But I think it's worthwhile to start with my story. So really, my journey into problematic gambling began right after 9/11. I was stationed at the time, I was actually in Wisconsin, next state over from here, and I was on orders to go to the Republic of Korea. At the time, I was married in my first marriage, and with 2 kids, both under the age of 5. I didn't want to go, because I knew I had to go on my own, excuse me, and then 9/11 occurred. And then I really didn't want to go, because I can remember the day 9/11 happened. I was in uniform, and I can remember somebody coming up to me and say, "Get in here, you need to see this." And when the second plane hit, I remember saying, "Oh, time to go to work." So not too long after that, I'm on a plane headed to the Republic of Korea with my children still in the United States with their mother, not knowing what's going to happen to any of us. I get over to Korea, I land the plane. I didn't land the plane, I didn't fly it, somebody else did. We landed in Osan Air Base in Korea, and the first thing I remember as we flew in was Patriot missiles pointed at our plane. Because again, we didn't know what was going to happen. Get into country, I get off the plane, they bust us to Yongsan, which is in Seoul. It was the main army base on the peninsula at the time. Put us up in a really, really, really nice hotel right there on the base. Got myself settled into my room. got something to eat because I was hungry. I was tired at that point, but I wasn't ready to go to sleep. I was stressed. I had anxiety. I had fear. And I'm walking around that night in the hotel and just checking things out. They had a really nice gift shop, really nice things to do, nice restaurants. And then all of a sudden, I look into this one room, and it was probably about the size of this room right here, all told. It wasn't huge. But I look in, and here is a casino-style slot machine room right there on the military base in front of me. Now, they don't have those here in the States, and I didn't even know they existed overseas, but I was like, okay. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I'm maybe 2 hours from Atlantic City. And I used to be able to, in my 20s, go down there and spend some money, and I'd be fine, and I'd go home. So I'm like, okay, I'll grab some money out of the machine, the ATM. I'll sit down, I'll play for a while until I'm tired, and then I'll go to bed. So I did. And I sat down and I started to play. And the first thing I noticed is that my shoulders started to relax a little bit. I'm like, okay, I'm starting to feel a little better. Maybe I'll be able to sleep. And then the biggest mistake that can happen to a budding problematic gambler happened, and I won. And I didn't break the bank, and I didn't get thrown out of the place, but I can remember, even standing here right now, in that moment, all of that fear, all of the anger, all of the anxiety, all of the stress, in that moment went away. And it felt good. That moment felt good. And I'm not going to say that I became a disordered gambler in that moment. What I will say is in that moment, a seed was planted. Because I wanted to feel that again. So I finished in processing. I got down to my unit, which was at the southern end of the peninsula in Pusan. And I was installed as the non-commissioned officer in charge of not just my squad, which was in Pusan, but the next squad north of us in Taegu. So I had about 25 soldiers I was in charge of. I had other non-commissioned officers, and then I had one officer above me that I had to answer to. But I was the enlisted guy in charge. So I got down, settled in, met the troops, got settled into where I was living, went for a little while, and then I think it was the Friday after I got there, I'm walking around, I go into our community club, which is the local bar on base, which they also have here in the States, but I'm in the community club. And lo and behold, to the back of the community club, here's a room, and it's another one of these rooms with slot machines in it. Not nearly as big, not nearly as glitzy, but it was there. And I'm like, okay. I had fun when I was up in Seoul doing this. I'll spend a little bit of time in here doing this again. What started off as a night of going in and having some fun turned into a Friday and Saturday thing. Then eventually turned into a Thursday, Friday, Saturday thing, then a Wednesday, Thursday. You get the picture. It started to build, and it started to become my sole source of entertainment when I wasn't working. Now, I was still going to work. I was still, working on a number of different things. We had to prepare for field time all the time. We were always getting ready to go to the field. We were a field-ready unit. So I was constantly prepping my soldiers. We were doing different drills, doing different things so that we could be ready to do our job. And we did a magnificent job. I actually helped develop a system that was adopted by our headquarters in Seoul and used throughout the peninsula for different squads for our prep to go to the field. They liked the way we did it, so they adopted it. So we're doing these things. I'm working with soldiers. I'm getting them ready to get promoted. I prepared myself for the expert field medical badge, which, if you know anything about that, is one of the most difficult badges in the Army to get. So I was able to prepare and get the expert field medical badge, but at the same time, there was this growing need to go to this room. So fast forward a little bit now, what was Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and now I'm adding Monday. Now I'm adding Tuesday. Now Saturday is going from the time they open in the morning till the time they close at night. Same thing starting to happen on Sunday. It's getting progressively worse. It's going from I enjoy doing this to I need to do this. And then moving from I need to do this to nothing is going to stop me from doing this. But of course, as this starts to progress, as my need to gamble in these rooms starts to progress, because it's my little safe haven, I'm running out of money because I'm not winning all the time. That win I had when I was in Seoul, that was a one-time thing. And while I would win periodically here and there, I was actually losing more than I was winning. So eventually, at the time, my wife at the time would send me twice a month when we would get paid. She would send me a stipend, which I would put into a local bank there on the base, and that would be my money for food and little trips or whatever. Well, eventually that money started to run out. But as the money's running out, the need to go is increasing still. So I started telling my wife excuses. I've got this soldier that needs this. We're going on this trip. I've got to do this. So she'd send me more money, right? Willingly at first, then begrudgingly, then not at all. Because after a while, it's like, come on, you don't need this much money. Something's not right here. And she knew. She didn't know what it was, but she knew something wasn't right. So she stopped sending money. When the money ran out there, of course, she's still sending me my regular amount, so I would spend that, but now it's going away almost instantly. Now it's going away very quickly. So I knew I was going to be there for a year, so I had a whole bunch of household goods shipped, a really nice bike, some electronic equipment. I sold it all. I sold my bike, I sold my electronic equipment, I started selling my clothing. I kept enough, but I sold everything else that I wasn't wearing at the time to have money to go back to that room. Now, of course, when you sell things, as opposed to bringing money in from somebody, that money goes away very quickly, right? So now money's running out real quick. Now it's gotten to the point where it's an obsession. Now I'm going during my lunch breaks. Now I'm saying to my officer in charge, I have a non-commissioned officer meeting on base at this time. I'm going to that meeting. I wasn't at the meeting. I was at the room. Okay? But now all my money's dried up, but the obsession is still there. So now I start turning to things that are not becoming a non-commissioned officer. This little creed that I read you right here, this is where I started to go against that creed. And I started borrowing money from my subordinates. These are people I'm supposed to be caring for. These are people I'm supposed to be preparing for combat and being their rock when we get into that situation so that they don't have to be, they know somebody's got their back. And now I'm borrowing money from them. That didn't last super long either because of the guilt and the shame I felt for doing it. I got them all paid back. I stopped borrowing money from them. Now we're getting closer to the end of my tour and I'm obsessed. I'm going as often as I possibly can. And that's when I did it. That's when I really crossed the line and I stole money from my own unit. We had a petty cash fund. I knew where it was. I was the non-commissioned officer in charge. I knew how much was in it at any given time. I knew right where it was. And I knew in my head that I was just going to borrow some out of it. I was going to go gamble because that's where I wanted to be. And then I would win the money and put it back. In my mind, I was convinced that was going to happen on this side of my mind, while this side of my mind saying, you idiot, you're going to go till it's all gone. I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew it. And yet I went. And sure enough, I spent the money till it was all gone. It was a day later when they discovered it missing and they started the investigation with the Criminal Investigation Division, the CID, and I walked down to them and I said, guys, don't even leave your office. You've got your guy. And I walked in and proceeded to tell them exactly what I did. I was so ashamed of what I had done because of all the other things that were going on that I was trying to do within the unit as a non-commissioned officer. This person that I was becoming, this person that was taking money and borrowing money and every day was in this ridiculous room, I felt so much shame. I'm like, I don't want to involve anybody else. I'm just going to go tell them what I did. Well, of course, immediately I was pulled out of my position. I had to be. It was the right thing to do, right? And then I was sent back to Seoul to our command so they could decide what they wanted to do with me. While they were trying to decide, I was put into an administrative position where I was given very, low-end odds and ends administrative work to do just to keep me busy until they were ready for me. And then I got to go see my commander, my colonel. And I sat down in front of him and he said to me, the first words out of his mouth was, we don't know what to do with you. You're doing all these great things for the unit. You developed this training system. You're getting your people promoted. You got your EFMB. There's just this money and character thing. All right? That's how it was said to me. And right then and there, I knew that nobody was going to be able to figure me out in that moment. I couldn't figure me out. I had no idea why I'm doing all this ridiculous stuff. But I knew it was gambling. I knew what that word was, but nobody used that word with me. It was about money, right? And it was about taking money. Then I went to my first sergeant, my enlisted leader in that unit, and she did my end-of-year non-commissioned officer evaluation because all that happened with my colonel was I was dropped one rank and told that I would be sent on my way to my next unit. That was the punishment I got. And he did it because he felt I had done so much good, he didn't want to punish me too harshly. In retrospect, I'm going to be honest with you, I wished I had been punished worse so I could have sought the help earlier. But instead, I was sent to my first sergeant. I got my end-of-year non-commissioned officer evaluation. All of my scores were the highest scores you can get except character. That one was low. So I got a good non-commissioned officer evaluation report, and I was sent on my way to my next unit back in the States. I get back to the States. I moved my family down to where I was in South Carolina. I was still gambling at that point, but it was not at the point where it was erupting yet. Right? Well, it kept going and going and going. I wasn't taking money. I wasn't doing that, but I was so confused as to why I couldn't stop that I went to work one day, and I had already been evaluated for a bad back. I have a degenerative disc and all this, so they had given me these painkiller pills. Well, I took the whole bottle because I'm like, I can't figure this out, and nobody's going to be able to help me. Nobody could have possibly understand what I'm going through here. This obsession is ridiculous. So I remember doing that, and I'm sitting in front of my computer in my office, and the next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital with my wife on one side of me, my boss on the other side of me saying, you need to go see a counselor. So I was not on a military base at the time. I was stationed remotely. So I went and saw a civilian counselor. My wife insisted on going with me. She was just angry with me at the time, and rightly so. Rightly so. So we went and saw the counselor, and I'm going to be honest with you, I told the counselor exactly what I thought she wanted to hear. I even cried a couple times, but not once did I tap into what I needed to tap into as I look back on it. We got through all that, we moved on with ourselves, and it got progressively worse to the point where when I came down on orders to go to my next duty station, my wife said to me, I don't know what's wrong with you. You'll never talk to me. I want to separate from you. So at that moment, I went to Texas by myself because my wife and I separated at that point, and my kids stayed with her. At that point, once again, because I'm alone, now I'm back in a stress situation, it went downhill very quickly. And that's when the second of my 4 suicide attempts occurred. This was in a small barracks room I was staying in while I was there, and it had these brick walls to it. I can picture it now as I'm describing it. And I just opened up a lane, and as fast as I could, I ran in headfirst to the wall as many times as I could. Well, it didn't work, obviously. So I turned myself into the hospital, at which point they sent me to a civilian acute psych ward, where once again, my commander and my officer in charge came down. I had regained my rank, by the way. I got back to the rank I was. But in the meantime, I had again stolen from my unit. This time I took electronic equipment and pawned it. Right? And then again, immediately admitted to it. So I'm in this acute psych ward. My commander shows up and again says, we don't know what to do with you. We're going to let you out of the Army. We're going to chapter you out of the Army, which, by the way, it was the right thing to do. I was doing too much damage as a non-commissioned officer. We're going to let you out under honorable conditions so you can go get the help you need. Well, what does that help look like? I didn't know what that help looked like. So they let me out. I go back up to Pennsylvania where I came from. Meanwhile, my wife and my kids are still in South Carolina. And from there, it just went downhill. I went through about 5 different jobs. I committed a felony. I had 2 more suicide attempts. And then I finally ended up in 2007. This was 2001 when all this started. In 2007, I was going to the VA, and nobody really knew what to do with me again, just like in the Army, until one lady, one counselor, I go in there and she's sitting and she pulls her desk drawer out and she pulls out this photocopied, stapled together packet that had dust on it that she shook off and put it down in front of me, and it said VA Gambling Treatment Program. She said, I'm not sure what this is, but here, you can look it up and go make some calls. Right? To this day, I'm going to tell you, there are still many, many VA clinicians that don't even know this exists. It is the oldest residential gambling treatment program of any kind in the United States. Started in 1972, right, by Dr. Robert Custer. But still, to this day, many, many VA clinicians don't know it exists. So I'm like, okay, I took it. I made the calls. They got me a bed. I went there. I got weighed. I got checked in. Finally went to see somebody. And for the first time in 6 years, somebody finally knew what I was going through. Finally. Right? By this time, I'm separated from my kids. I walked in there. I'm 6'1". When I walked in there, I was 155 pounds. I weighed nothing. Tell me there's not a physical effect that goes along with a gambling addiction. I'll tell you, I'm sorry, I don't believe you. So I got in there. I got into treatment. I went through their inpatient program. I went through their aftercare program. I got involved in Gamblers Anonymous. And then I made the second biggest mistake a gambler can make. And when I got through all that, I said, I feel good. I don't need this anymore. I'm good. I'm cured. I'm an Army guy. I'm tough. I got what I need now. And slowly but surely, it began to creep back in. In the meantime, I had gotten divorced from my first wife and connected with my high school sweetheart, who is my wife now. We got together. We got married. The whole time, my addiction was rebuilding. Right? There's something I want to throw in between here, too, that I had not mentioned. I lost complete contact with my children for 2 years during some of the most impressionable years of their lives. And that's important because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So I connected with the woman who's now my wife. We built a lovely relationship together very quickly, but the whole time the addiction was slowly creeping back in. This time I wasn't running off to casinos. This time I was manipulating money. I had credit cards she didn't know about. So to pay the credit card she didn't know about, I took out a loan that she didn't know about. So that temporarily takes care of this, but then creates a situation here. So I again went and took out another loan, right? This was building up to the point where I of course, the gambler mentality, I'm trying to figure out a magical way to cure all this. So she went on a trip to Houston to see her son for a week. In the meantime, I resold my truck, which I had just paid off. I went and took out a title loan on it for about $17,000, which was gone in about 4 hours in a casino. So this was in 2019. Fast forward to the end of 2019. You know what? Before I go to the end of 2019, there is a story I want to tell you before my first time going into treatment. Just before I went into treatment. It was a Friday night. I had just gotten paid by the job I was working for. So I decided I was going to the casino, to make a whole lot of money, knowing full well in the back of my mind I wasn't going to do that. This is when I was about at the worst of my addiction. I had about $500. I get down to the casino. As I'm driving towards the casino, I'm screaming at myself at the top of my lungs, turn around, go back. You know exactly what's going to happen. And I remember looking up in the mirror, I could see the veins on the side of my head, and I could see the tears running down my cheeks, but I kept driving towards that casino. I get down there. I get into the parking garage. I'm still tense. I walk up to the doors. I open the door. Now I can hear the bells, I can see the lights, I can see the people buzzing around, and instantly I felt better. So I walk into that casino with my $500, and sure enough, I made money pretty quickly. I went up, right? In fact, I went up a couple $1,000s probably within the first hour. Well, naturally, I stayed until it was gone. This was a Friday night I had gone down there, so I'm like, okay, it's Saturday morning. By this time I'm feeling my normal shame and guilt and all the things I don't want to feel. So I'm like, I'll go home like I normally do, and I'll go, lick my wounds, and we'll move on. I go out to my car, I get in the car, I start the car, and I hear Sunday morning music. And I'm like, why am I hearing Sunday morning music on the radio on a Saturday? It wasn't Saturday. I had been there 36 hours and didn't know it. Ate no food. Barely drank anything, only went to the bathroom when I had to. In fact, if I had figured out a way around that, I probably would have done that too. So I get in the car, and now I'm even more remorseful than I was thinking it was Saturday. So I drive back home, and I go to the parking lot of my local grocery store, and I just sit there to try and contemplate, what can I do? Well, sitting next to me was a full bottle of antidepressants, so once again, I took the bottle of antidepressants, thinking, this is it, I'm done. And then realized after I did it that I wasn't trying to end everything, I just was screaming for help. So I took myself to the local hospital, got checked into the psych ward there, drank a whole lot of charcoal, was there overnight, woke up the next morning, realized that there was a paycheck in my mailbox, somehow managed to check myself out against medical advice. I don't know how they even let me do it. But I checked myself out against medical advice, went out, got that check, cashed it, went back to that same casino, and 2 hours later I was broke again. And at that point, I knew I was done. I couldn't do it on my own. That was the first time going into treatment. Now, fast forward back to 2019. Through the end of the last, about this time of the year, 5 years ago today, until about the end of the year, I was so desperate for money, I started looking up these internet philanthropists that you see online and got scammed out of even more money, knowing full well what I was doing, but so desperate to come up with money, I would do anything at that point. So it's January 3rd, 2020. I told my wife, I'm really, really sick. I'm going to sit on the couch, right? So I sat on the couch and decided to be sick for the entire weekend. I had a knife in my pocket I'd gotten from the American Legion that if my wife had ever found out all of the things that I was doing over several years that she knew nothing about, that I was going to walk to the back of my property and I had an exit plan ready. And there was no stopping me this time. So I sat on my couch knowing that I was making the decision whether I wanted to live or die. And during that weekend, and I tell this story and I get chuckles from it, and I chuckle sometimes when I tell it, but it's as true as I'm standing here. During that weekend, I get Morgan Freeman's voice in my head from Shawshank Redemption going, get busy living or get busy dying. God is my witness, it happened. And obviously I chose to get busy living. So Monday, January 6, 2020, I went to my local VA. I said, I want to hurt myself. I need to be checked in. And I said, but you need to give me a minute because I have to call my wife, where I proceeded to call her and tell her everything that I'd done. If I can pick a moment in my life that I never, ever, ever want to relive again, that's one of them. She trusted me more than just about any human on the planet. What I said was true. If I told her I was going somewhere, I was going somewhere. And now I just took several years of that and just burned it and threw it away and took all of the trust that she had given me willingly and freely and just crumpled it up like a piece of paper and threw it away. I will never forget that moment as long as I live. I will never forget it. So I went back into that acute psych. I got myself back into the gambling treatment program in March of 2020, for which I'm eternally grateful. I started going to Gamblers Anonymous in 2020. I still go to my same Gamblers Anonymous meeting to this day. And I'm so grateful I do it. When I got out, I made the decision that the difference between 2007 and 2020 was in 2007, I knew I had a gambling problem. In 2020, I knew I was absolutely powerless over it unless I continued to do something about it. I live with a disease. And if I don't take my medicine, I go right back to the disease. So now I go to my Gamblers Anonymous meetings every week. I ended up starting a podcast to talk about military service members, veterans, and gambling. I wrote a book about it. And I'm so involved in my recovery now. I work with gamblers every single day, which keeps me connected to my own recovery. My children, I told you earlier about I'd lost contact with my children, right? My son now lives in my house. He just moved up from South Carolina because he's looking for a place and a job up here, so he's living with us temporarily. My daughter, her husband, my 2 granddaughters, and now my 3rd grandchild on the way live 10 minutes away from me. I see them all the time. When I got into treatment the second time, one of the clinicians said to me, what do you want from this program? I said, I want my legacy to be simple. I don't want to be the grandfather who lies or disappears or tells you things and takes money. I just want to be grandpa. That's all I want to be. Well, I'm not. I'm Grampy. They decided my name's Grampy. I don't decide. They do. But I see them all the time. I just saw them the day before I came here. And every time I see them now, I sit and I think, oh my God, is it nice to be able to live in this moment right now? The difference between me then and me now is within a month, both of my parents have passed on. If this had happened 5 years ago, I would be at a casino right now, not wanting to deal with it. Now I allow myself to grieve. Now I allow myself to feel their presence. I allow myself to honor them. What a different life I get to lead now. You know, so when I do this stuff, I do it to show that hope is possible. So that's my story, but I want to get on now to military service members and veterans as it relates to gambling. So Our learning objectives are we're going to understand what constitutes problem gambling and type of gambling. And I know for a lot of you this is a review, but I always like to go over it because I do speak with groups where there may be a little bit of confusion. Learn the history of gambling within the military. Learn why veterans and service members are at higher risk. Learn about the correlation between disordered gambling and suicide, which we talked about earlier, right? Learn about the impact of disordered gambling on the family. And resources available not only for the addicted gambler, but for the affected family members of the addicted gambler. What an important aspect of this whole thing is talking about the loved ones that are impacted by it. Learn how to help the veteran struggling with problematic gambling issues. We're going to do a little bit of cultural talk about military and veterans. Okay? So let's start off with what is gambling. So we often ask that question, what exactly is gambling? Well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about, first of all, types of gambling, okay? There's traditional forms of gambling. You have your casino gambling, you have your slot machines, you have horse racing, you have all these different things that are available, poker, roulette, table games, right? But what about sports betting or sports gambling? Thank you for the terminology because that's what it is. It's sports gambling. Right? And I have Michigan up there because that's the last time I used this. I apologize. You're still working on it here in Minnesota, right? We've had it in Pennsylvania almost since the Supreme Court said go. Our helpline numbers basically tripled almost overnight. And in every state that I've talked in where they've done it, the same thing has basically happened. Video game terminals or skill machines. You see that picture on the right? In my state, Pennsylvania, you go into a mini market, you go into a bar, you go into a restaurant, and you'll see these machines, which they call skill machines. They're video slot machines, and they're not regulated. You can't self-exclude from these machines because the money doesn't go to the state. The money goes to the organization that runs these. The reason I say that's significant is because you go into an American Legion, a VFW, or some of these VSOs, Veteran Service Offices, right? Places, and this is where they make their money. This is where they make their money. I don't have a problem with them making their money from this source. My problem is we're not educating people on the dangers of it. That's where I've had my problem, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. The stock market, crypto, lottery, bingo. I had a guy in my treatment when I went in 2020 who was in my cohort at the VA Gambling Treatment Center who was addicted to claw machines. He had 4 warehouses that he paid for years that were stuffed with toys from claw machines. And when I first met him, I'm like, come on. But I got to talking to him. It was the same thing. It was the same thing. Right? So what is gambling? Starts with risk. Right? You're risking something of value, okay, on the chance that you're going to get a reward of greater value. That's gambling. Do you notice on that entire string, not once did I use the word money? Because yes, money tends to be the catalyst more often than not, but it's not about the money. It's about the risk. It's about the thrill. It's about the chase. It's about feeling good in that moment. Right? Gamblers Anonymous defines it as any betting or wagering for self or others, whether for money or not, no matter how slight or insignificant, where the outcome is uncertain or depends upon chance or skill. Okay, it's a wide definition, and there's a reason it's a wide definition, because it's not about the mechanics of doing it, it's about the feeling it creates. So the spectrum of gambling behaviors, there's the non-gambler, social gambler, the at-risk gambler, which is now, this is about, I'm going to say a month or so into my tour in Korea. This is about where I am. Then very quickly over the next month, I went from there all the way to here, to the disordered gambler. Okay? So let's talk about gambling in the military. This is in a letter that George Washington wrote to a cousin of his. Now understand, George Washington was a gambler. But he wrote this and said, gambling is the child of avarice, the brother of iniquity, and the father of mischief. It's been the ruin of many a worthy families, the loss of many a man's honor, and the cause of suicide. This was George Washington. How long has gambling been around in the U.S. military? There's your answer. Okay? That's from Harper's Weekly. People who were caught gambling obsessively, they got those signs put on the back of their this was during the Civil War. They got these signs put on their backs that said gambler, and they were given beans, they were given food to gamble with, and they were told, you will gamble with this. If you lose it, you don't eat. That was their punishment. So punishment goes way back. Okay? In the 1930s, the DOD introduced slot machines across the military spectrum. Right? And then guess what? They took them back out because there were so many problems with them. They took them back off all military bases until the 1980s when the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force said, we have soldiers stationed overseas who need entertainment. Can we please put slot machines back in overseas military bases? Doesn't impact us here in the States because nobody sees it. So they were put back into overseas military bases. Okay? Why do soldiers and veterans gamble? Let me go, how do I go back here? There we go. This is the warrior ethos. Anybody ever heard of the warrior ethos? Okay? This is the creed that we live by in the military. When you raise your right hand in the military and then you get sent off to basic training and all your hair gets cut off, this is now the motto you're going to live by. I will always place the mission first. I'll never accept defeat. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. Think about that for a second. When you put on a uniform, when I put on my uniform, my job was to take all of my problems, all of my stresses, all the things that I was going through and leave them at the door because I had a job to do and a mission to accomplish. We were taught early on in the Army and as non-commissioned officers that our job was to take all measures to deter war, but if war occurs, to win. That was our job. Okay? In order to do that, you need a clear head to be able to focus on the mission. In order to do that, you're taught very quickly to take everything and set it aside. Put it in a duffel bag and leave it at the door. The problem is when the mission's over, nobody teaches you how to unpack that duffel bag. That's where the problem comes in. All right, so why do service members and veterans gamble? And these, you're probably familiar with these types. The overstimulated gambler gambles to dissociate, right? Gambles to escape. That was me. I went to gamble because I was constantly under stress and wanted that stress to go away. And that good feeling that win gave me made me want to keep going back to get away from the problems that I was having because I felt good, right? I was the overstimulated. The understimulated gambler, that's the ego gambler. That's the guy that's sitting at the casino at the roulette table with all of his buddies behind him, making sure they see exactly what he's doing. He's understimulated. If you've ever talked to anybody who was in the initial Marine surge into Fallujah early on in Iraq, right? Any of those guys who've gone into gambling, they tend to be understimulated gamblers because when you go at that high of a tempo, it's hard to recreate. And they spend a lot of their lives trying to recreate the adrenaline and the sheer pressure they felt in that initial surge. So they'll spend their lifetime trying to recreate it. And that's where the understimulated gambler can come from. Here's the issue. The understimulated gambler eventually also becomes an overstimulated gambler. The ego gambler, if they do it long enough and the addiction goes far enough, becomes an escape gambler. And I've seen that with friends of mine who were in the military program. I've watched it happen. Why does it matter? Service members and veterans have a higher suicide rate than those who do not serve. Okay? Service members and veterans have a higher rate of problem gambling. Almost twice the rate of their civilian counterparts, military service members and veterans are at risk for problematic gambling. There are studies that go across the board, but on average and in general, you'll see about twice the rate of their civilian counterparts. Couple that with the extreme higher rates of suicidality among military service members and veterans, put them together, right? And what do? You get the perfect storm. Let's talk about co-occurring. And these are just some general stats I'm going to I'm going to go through these. A national survey found 2.2% screen positive for at-risk. This is 2017. We haven't even put in, this is before the advent of online casino and sports betting, right? 4.2% of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans exhibit at-risk problematic gambling. Again, 2016. 40 to 60% of gamblers seeking treatment reported a previous suicide attempt. 40 to 60% of veterans who were seeking treatment for problematic gambling reported at least one suicide attempt. I reported 4. Among veteran problem gamblers seeking treatment, high rates of co-occurring SUD, alcohol use disorder, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, high rates of co-occurrence of almost all of these. Veterans with gambling disorder and pain disorder were almost 2 times as likely to attempt suicide than those with just pain disorder. Okay? And rates of problem gambling among active duty military, and this was from a study done in 2022, which is why I decided to put it on there, 3.5 times higher than the general population. There was a study done a few years ago, and it wasn't a small population. I don't remember what the exact number was, but it was all active duty military service members. I want to say the population was over 1,000, almost 2,000. 70% of them exhibited at least 4 of the criteria out of the DSM-5. 70% of them. But that was an independent study. You can't just put that up and say these are the numbers, right? But if you go on the averages, 3.5 times is probably a low number. But that's about the best we've got right now. What are the causes? Low social support upon return from deployment. Military experiences and problem gambling. Okay, and I'm going to get into some more of these, a little more depth in these in a minute. Less than 10% of people with gambling problems seek help due to the shame and stigma. All right, in the military, and it's getting better. I'm going to say this. It's getting better. But we have a long way to go. In the military, gambling disorder and gambling problems are treated as a money problem and a disciplinary issue. If someone is identified with a gambling problem, it's treated as a money problem and a disciplinary issue, not a mental health problem and an addiction. That needs to change. So what happens is because of that, you run the risk of losing a security clearance. You run the risk of losing rank. You run the risk of losing your career. I lost rank. I lost my career. And yet, I don't remember anybody saying to me gambling. Right? And here's why. If you're in the middle of a gambling addiction and you hold a high security clearance and somebody comes up to you and says, hey, guess what? I can help you solve this little debt you've got going on here and these issues you have going on. I just need a little bit of information. You're walking around with sensitive information, right? So from a DoD perspective, there's a need to be that tough on it. There is a need to be that tough on not risking national security and not risking unit readiness. That being said, it needs to be coupled with understanding that this is a mental health issue and addiction. So take away their ability to suspend their security clearance and get them into treatment. Might be a better alternative. Okay? Let's talk about before I move on, let's talk about the slot machines overseas because I didn't finish what I was thinking about that. At one time, there were over 3,000 slot machines on overseas military bases. I don't know if that number is exactly the same, but it's not too far off. The highest number I saw, and it's run by the Morale, Welfare, and Recreation, which is the DoD organization that gathers money to help, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, particularly in this case overseas, to go on trips, to have gyms, to have bowling alleys, to have things to do. It's a great cause. At one point, these machines were bringing in $120 million a year. Number one, that $120 million is coming out of the pockets of soldiers, sailors, airmen, the very people that you're trying to create entertainment for. Number two, not one penny of that is turned over to educate, screen, or treat for problematic gambling. And I'm going to tell you, if I had walked into those rooms and I'd seen signs on the wall that say, these are the signs, gambling can be addictive, these are the signs of it, Here's how it can impact your family and your career. I may have thought twice about it. I'm not saying I would have. I'm saying I might have, but I was never given that opportunity. I was never given that opportunity. And to this day, I'm going to tell you, I work with a couple active duty service members. They're still not getting that opportunity. That needs to change. All right, transitioning. A lot of people talk about military service and veterans, but very few people talk about the space in between, transitioning. You go from a lifestyle that's very high-paced, you're given weaponry to walk around with, you have very clear and instructed orders, okay? You're thrown into a situation where you have to have situational awareness, because if you don't, you could get killed, okay? You oftentimes have very clear-cut rules where this is what you've done wrong, here's the impact, and here's what we're going to do. And after sometimes 5, 10, 15, even 20 years of doing this, now all of a sudden you move into, you don't have the cohesion of a team anymore, right? Team cohesion is everything in the military. You have to have each other's back or you die. You no longer have that available. You no longer have that rigid structure. I remember when I got out of the military, I went right into a management job, and I had somebody I had to deal with, and I sat down with them and I took a military approach, which was, this is what you've done, this is what the rules say, this is what's going to happen, and literally got pulled into HR the next day and told I did it wrong. Well, now hold up, but these are the kind of things we're talking about. You're basically given a DD-214, which is the paper that says you're no longer in the military, and here's your history, right? You're shown out of the door, and now your life is very different. You might be hyper-vigilant. You might be what they call walking the perimeter. Remember I talked about you have to have that high level of situational awareness? When you come out here, that level of situational awareness, unless you're living somewhere in an inner city, right, doesn't need to be quite so high anymore, and yet it's still there. You're locked and loaded at home. I can't tell you the number of military veterans I know who not only own weapons, but on a regular basis will patrol their property. Okay? Aggressive driving. Let me talk about that for a second. I've talked to a number of different people, veterans, who have gotten stopped by the police because they will fly down the highway, right? And when you ask them why, they'll say, that's what I've been trained to do because I don't know if I turn a corner and an IED is coming at me. So there's hypervigilance on the highways, which can create accidents, which can cause tickets. There's so many things in transition that so many people don't realize. When you're stepping out of that military lifestyle, you're stepping into a whole new world, right? When someone goes off to a deployment or goes into the military, their family knows them as this person. When they get out of there and they put their stripes down and they take their uniform off, all the people that are on the outside of the military still expect them to be this person. They're not that person anymore. And that can cause conflict because everybody expects them to be that same person, and they're not the same person. Even the veteran doesn't realize they're not quite the same person. So that can have an impact on problematic gambling, on disordered gambling. Okay? So here's the impact on the service members and their family. On the service member, they're impacting unit readiness. So there's going to be trouble somewhere in there. It's more often treated as a money and a disciplinary issue than an addiction. When somebody falls into a gambling addiction, 90% of the time they're put into a drug or alcohol program, if they're put into anything at all, or a general mental health program. There are no existing gambling treatment programs in the military, with the exception of, on occasion, the VA gambling treatment program in Cleveland will take in active duty service members on a case-by-case basis. More often than not, it's because they're special operations and the DOD has invested a lot of money in them, and they're trying to protect their investment. That's more often than not the people that will go to this program. There is a policy written in one of the military services, and I'm not going to go tell you which one and which one it is. You can look that up on your own if you want, because I don't want to go down that route. But I will tell you, in 2020, that policy, their drug and alcohol policy, was updated to include gambling everywhere that it said drugs and alcohol, to include education, screening, and treatment. And yet half the clinicians in the Army don't know exists, and the other half refuse to use it because they weren't taught how to use it. So there's still no treatment program for gambling in the military. Okay? All right. Loss of security clearance. That alone can cause problems. Family hardship and unhealthy resolution. theft, loans, credit cards. If you've ever been around a major military installation, they're usually surrounded by buy here, pay here car places and predatory loan companies. Because it's guaranteed money, because guess what? If they don't make payments, all that car loan place or loan place has to do is call their command and they'll get their money. And that soldier sailor will get in trouble. So, family devastation, self-harm, domestic violence, very common with this disorder in the military. All right, impacts on the family, financial ruin. The family's all of a sudden been financially ruined and didn't even know it was coming. Didn't know it was happening. Okay? Housing issues. Oftentimes, military service members are put onto base housing. If that service member gets in trouble because of a money issue, I might even say because of a gambling issue, because of a money issue, they can get kicked out of their housing. Now they have nowhere to live. Right? Embarrassment. Imagine being the person in that military housing, because you often live near people that are stationed with you, and you know, your teammates find out what's going on. Now their family members are looking at your family members, and there's an embarrassment level that goes along with it. Potential domestic issues, relationship strains, right? Can occur outside of the military too, but within the military community, it's more tight-knit, and everybody knows what's happening with everybody, so it gets magnified. Okay? Researchers found that of those individuals with lifetime history of problematic gambling, 49% received treatment for a mental health or substance use disorder, but none received any treatment for gambling problems. 0. Not one. Think about that for a second. Okay? This is the Department of Defense. This is the Army, the Navy, Marine Corps. You know, everything's on point. Not everything. Not everything. Stigma. And I talked about this a little bit. Because it's treated as a money and a disciplinary issue, service members oftentimes will not come forward. They just won't talk about it. And that needs to change. There are quarterly, semi-annual, and annual trainings done in all branches of service to talk about different things like consideration of others, equal opportunity, even drugs and alcohol. But in none of those trainings is gambling ever discussed. Okay? Barriers to treatment. Just look at some of these credos up here. Loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, courage, commitment, right? In all of these things, you're so dedicated, you're taught in order to dedicate yourself to your country, your military service, your unit, and then comes your family and yourself. But those three things always come first. Put all your stuff aside. Okay? Secrecy, stoicism, and denial are crucial for the success of the warrior. Okay? And there's no formalized treatment. Veterans and service members are often treated in substance abuse. Individual therapists are not qualified to deal with gambling. There are great alcohol and drug counselors across the spectrum of military service. They're trained clinicians that can work in addiction, right? And many of you may be familiar with this little thing we call the 30-hour course for problem gambling. All we would have to do is integrate that and add that in. But it's not being done. So they're not trained. They don't know how to deal with people who struggle with gambling. Veterans are rarely referred to qualified non-VA providers. So even outside of the VA system, they're not sending them where they need to go. Okay? And most VA mental health service lines and DoD state components are minimally aware or just flat out not aware of the VA's gambling treatment program. It's improving. It's improving. We have a long way to go. Okay? So what sort of resources do we have available? And there are many more. You know, obviously within the state of Minnesota, the council can give you a lot more resources to tap into. These are very general. For the service member is the VA Gambling Treatment Program. Operation Responsible Gambling is a website put together by the National Council on Problem Gambling to give service members and veterans additional resources to reach out to as it relates to problem gambling. Military One Source also has information on gambling within it. Gamblers Anonymous I can't say enough about Gamblers Anonymous. And yes, there are many avenues to treatment. There are many avenues to recovery. And that maybe the 12-step program is not for everybody, but there's still a lot of people who don't know about it and the power that it has. Okay? And then there are other things available, like Celebrate Recovery, Smart Recovery, those sorts of things. For the impacted others, the loved ones, I can't speak highly enough about Gam-Anon. When I first admitted to my wife about my addiction, and I had a conversation with the guys at my table about this earlier, a lot of the conversation was around, why did you do it? You really hurt me. I want you to know how bad I hurt. I want to understand what you did, right? So there was a lot of that. Then she began going to Gam-Anon, and what she began to understand was that she didn't have control over how I got to that point. But she learned more about the addiction and what her role, if she were to decide to stay with me, what her role in all of that was going to be, and how to navigate all that, right? And how to make sure that, how to shield herself to learn the signs and symptoms to say, okay, you know what? If you want to continue doing this, you're on your own. Rather than say, I'm going to fix you, she learned how to take care of her while at the same time being able to hold my hand and better understand what I was going through. So now we do it together. Now we do it as a team. Every Wednesday night, we drive 20 minutes. I go to one side of the hall to Gamblers Anonymous. She goes to the other side of the hall to Gam-Anon, and together we recover. The one thing to always remember is the loved ones of a problematic gambler have to go through recovery as well. And oftentimes it can be even worse than what the gambler's going through because they were not expecting it. I blindsided my wife so bad, I can't even begin to describe it. Again, it's hard for me to even talk about. So I'm glad she chose to step into her own recovery. So that's me. That's my podcast. That is my website and my email right there. And I guess we've got a little bit of time, so I can open it up for any questions or anything like that you might have. The only residential gambling treatment program is in Cleveland. There was one opened near Dulles Air Force Base in Las Vegas for a while. I believe it's still there, but there are some issues there where it's not fully operational. So
We do have a treatment provider on the list, Roger Anton, and Roger exclusively sees veterans and active military.
is that on an outpatient basis? Okay. Which is still, it's a great resource. Yeah. All right. Yes. I'm not even going to hesitate to answer that question. I was in a position where I could manipulate my time so that the people in my unit really didn't know. Here's the problem. When you walk into that room, many of the people that are in that room are struggling with the same thing I am, so nobody's really going to say it. And the people running the room oftentimes are nationals from within that country. They're not trained on what to look for. Had somebody walked up to me on a Saturday at 4 o'clock and say, you've been here for about 6 hours. Are you okay? I might have thought twice about it because I might have thought, who's watching? Who's watching? I need to stop. Oh, yeah. I felt, and I'm going to say this, I felt completely safe in that room. Like nobody was going to discover me. You can't, if you spend enough time in the military, you're definitely going to see some version of that. It's, the Saturday night poker game. There's a fellow veteran that I worked with who often described, he was on what's called a recovery team. which means after somebody went out and a battle occurred, his job was to go out and clean up the area. So they had a lot of downtime. They literally on their base, because there were no slot machines in theater, right? You wouldn't find them in Iraq or Afghanistan. So they built a plywood hut, basically, had an exclusive membership and started a poker club. They were betting money they didn't have. They were betting future money. So they didn't even realize how much money they were losing because they got called on it. When they left and they had access to the money, they got called on it. So, and that occurs more often than people realize. So the answer is yes, I've seen it. And there's kind of no way you can't see it. My God, we were in the field one time waiting for transportation coming out of the field. And if you know anything about MREs, they have crackers in them. These things are soda crackers. You can't eat one of them without your mouth completely drying out, right? So we would put money down on how far you could get into one of these, how many people could finish a whole cracker. I mean, literally, we'd bet on that kind of stuff. And it's fun when you're not in the addiction. When you are in the addiction, it can get real serious real quick. So.
Have all the providers or clinicians you've worked with been in the military service or vets of some sort? Or the professionals that you work with?
They've not been. In fact, the person who runs the gambling treatment program was never in the military, but both understands the military lifestyle and understands the lifestyle of somebody who's been through problem gambling better than sometimes some of the people who've been through it. She is an amazing human being who knows who we are. And that's important. It's an important point you bring up is, and this happens outside of military, but when you're in a military structure like that, you'll oftentimes see military service members saying, you didn't serve, you can't understand me. And then you add gambling to that, you never gambled, you can't understand me. So they create their own resistance to getting into help. As soon as somebody steps in, like Dr. Chapman, who runs the program out there, and establishes the fact that she can connect with you no matter what, she wipes those barriers right away and does it very quickly. And I think that's the key to this is it's working with military service members and veterans, if you've never worked with them and if you've never been in the military, right, let them know you're not the expert on what they've been through. Ask them to fill in the blanks for you. If you make them the expert, you'll connect very quickly. I can't understand what you've been through because I didn't wear the uniform. I need you to help me. I need you to be the expert and guide me through it. I can work with you on the rest of it, but in order to do that, I have to better understand who you are. And it starts to break down those barriers a little more quickly. At least it did for me. So.
I know that you've been beating the drum on having the Department of Defense improve services, and you've mentioned a couple of times that things are getting better. Can you talk about some of the improvements that you've seen?
Sure. Number one of the military services actually stepped up and had all of their clinicians, and I was a part of the group that did this, provide all of their drug and alcohol counselors with training on gambling, right? It was the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps took all of their SACs, their substance abuse counselors, 2 years in a row, put them on a virtual call and let us teach them about gambling. So that's part one. Now, they haven't been able to fully implement it yet, but at least we're stepping in the right direction. Number two, there are organizations out there, now they're pocketed, they're siloed, but who are being allowed onto military bases to start giving little trainings about problematic gambling. So it's very localized right now, but it is starting to happen, more so than I've seen before.
Is there any education in the military academies about gambling problems?
I did a training for 1,000 cadets at the Air Force Academy in January. It's the only, it was it was groundbreaking. It's the first time it's ever been done. So the answer is no, but we're getting there. We're actually working with, we're working to try to get in with West Point now. Don't know, it could take years, but there's motion. We're chipping away at it. So.
Do you feel that the slot machines and everything on the bases are not going to be taken away
You know, it's funny. Not too long ago, Representative Paul Tonko out of New York introduced a bill into Congress to take all of those slot machines away. I responded to that personally, not through any organization, but personally, to say that I wasn't completely on board with that idea. And I'm going to tell you why. Because it generates a lot of money for MWR, for morale, welfare, and recreation, right? And because if you take all of those away, the service members who are addicted are going to find another way to do it. When I was in Korea, if I didn't go to the base I was at, I could hop on a bus and within 20 minutes I was at a Korean casino. I think a better way to approach that, I think something needs to be done, but I think a better way to approach that is to mandate that a percentage of that money that comes in be used to educate, screen, and treat. Use it to put signage on the walls. Use it to teach the people working the floors to look for certain things. Teach it to take your existing clinician force and give them a 30-hour course to teach them about gambling, right? Use it to bring somebody in to teach your non-commissioned officers and officers what gambling looks like and how to teach your soldiers about it. I think that would be a better approach, because if you're bringing in $120 million a year, what's 2% of that? That could go a long way to educating, screening, and treating. And then what will happen is you'll start to see people coming out of the woodwork who might have hidden from it. I think that's a better way to approach it. That's just my opinion. I don't align with any organization when I say that, other than myself, from my own experience.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, everyone.